Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another edition of Black Focus. I'm your host, Ron Edwards, coming to you from the corporate studios and corporate headquarters of MTN, Minneapolis Television Network. Actually, it's a beautiful day, as you can see behind us, as we are in the patio studio. Yes, we're doing it. But it's a little chilly outside, but let me tell you, I'd rather have this setting of weather than I would a snowstorm. Okay, so this is just fine, if you will. Well, a lot of things going on. We have a lot of things to talk about this afternoon. Again, we're coming from the corporate studios of MTN. All kinds of things going on, if you will. We are watching a serious situation to the south of us, obviously, and that is the caravan of over 7,000, they say, individuals, primarily from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, maybe even some from Nicaragua, who are streaming into Mexico. They are now 50 miles inside of southern Mexico. They've still got another 1,000 miles to go. Some are saying that the caravan will not attempt to cross the border at Brownsville, Texas, or Laredo, but will actually go another 700 to 800 miles across to Tijuana and attempt to come across the border south of San Diego. It is interesting to watch what is happening, how it is happening, what is being said, if you will, with regards to how the Trump administration will respond. I'm afraid that the Trump administration will respond with military presence. I'm not talking about Border Patrol or State Highway Patrol in to places like California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. I'm talking about the military. With the midterms so close and so many races tight, if you will, in all parts of the United States, this president wants to let his base know that he is a tough hitter, if you will. He is a tough president, if you will. He will not back down or let anybody back him down, if you will. And so I'm afraid that he will take a calculated risk as the caravan, and by the way, the projection is that the caravan will be in close proximity to the U.S. border about the same time that we have the election on the 6th of November. The volatility as it pertains to these migrants, if you will, is dangerous. It's at a very dangerous high, if you will. It comes at a time when there are additional problems in the Middle East. As an example, Saudi Arabia, who clearly thought that they could pull a fast one in the murder. They finally now admit that a columnist who used to be a favorite of the royal family of Saudi Arabia died, and there's so many narratives now you can't keep up with it, that he, Mr. Hosky, died in a fistfight inside of the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The Saudi embassy, of course, would be in Ankara, the capital of Turkey. Of course, Istanbul, the largest city in Turkey, if you will, still kind of the heart and soul of the history of the Ottoman Empire of Turkey, and et cetera. And so we see all of this at play, a lot of pressure out there. The president is making all kinds of boasts. He said something last night in Houston, Texas, that has caught the attention of a lot of people. And I don't know why people are surprised, because we in the fourth estate have been talking about it even before the votes were counted. The Electoral College was counted in 2016. And that is, he, before a crowd that was clearly his base, pumped up and et cetera, indicated that he is a nationalist, if you will. Now, many of us who have studied the American political scene know that. I mean, that he's a nationalist, if you will. Is he a white nationalist? I believe so. I clearly believe so. But I don't know why people are so shocked on what he had said. Again, he is playing to his base. The president is playing to the base. Nationalism has actually always been strong in this country. But let me tell you a little story, a narrative. 30 years ago, when Black America was really on the move and was talking in terms of the civil rights movement, if you will, and etc., people started being identified as black nationalists. And that was allegedly repugnant, if you will. That was something that was not in keeping with the tradition of America. I mean, come on, y'all. Back in the Revolutionary War of 1777 to 1781, the so-called founding fathers of the United States of America, you know, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, and all of those gentlemen, if you will, were quote unquote nationalists. They were nationalistic. They wanted separation from England, if you will, from King George, if you will. They wanted to set up their own empire. No one really talks and writes about that within the honest context of how it should be viewed, if you will. Yes, they were talking back then when they came together at Constitutional Hall. I mean, they were talking about a kingdom, if you will. You know, the imperial quote unquote kingdom in the western regions of quote unquote the Atlantic, and that being the United States, gave it its name, the 13 colonies, if you will. The hell with the Indians, you know, the Native Americans, the indigenous people who had been on this continent, if you will, for a million years. But it was quite clear that nationalism is not anything new. It's just who it is that is accepted as having the right to say, I am a nationalist, if you will. Now, some people, I was watching a couple programs earlier this morning, if you will, they were talking and doing comparisons to Adolf Hitler, who was, you know, the resident, quote unquote, nationalist in the historical perspectives of a world in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, it was far beyond a beer hall in Munich, Germany. Adolf Hitler knew and understood how to play nationalism, if you will. He knew how to play the Aryan Brotherhood, if you will, the Aryan race situation. He made race a significant political issue in Germany starting in 1926, 1925. He ultimately began to take control, Adolf Hitler, of Germany, if you will, ultimately ousting President Hindenburg. And so once he became chancellor, if you will, Führer, if you will, he really practiced nationalism to the tune of, you know, the deaths of over 77 million people throughout Europe and North Africa, the Middle East, if you will. And so when I hear all this hand-wringing that goes on, I just think that we're being disingenuous. We're being dishonest, you understand? We are really not being the honest people and the honest nation that we try to pretend to be, okay? Nationalism is here, always has been here, and unfortunately will continue to reside here in the United States of America until we find a combination of leadership and doctrine that indicates that maybe nationalism is or not is healthy for this nation. It's all a part of what is happening. So the statement by the president last night in Houston, Texas, that he was a nationalist, I mean, come on, you watch it. The man is, you know, a production of Hollywood, even though he pretends that he hates Hollywood until he's chasing the actresses and those young ladies, and then of course he loves Hollywood, if you will. But He clearly is an actor. He knows how to play it out. He is playing it out. He is playing to the base, if you will. That's the reason we said just a couple minutes ago that one needs to really keep their eye on the caravan, as it is being referred to, that is moving now up through southern Mexico. As we said just minutes ago, the calculation is that the caravan should be arriving in close proximity to the American border. You know, there are a lot of people that want to play the role of vigilante, if you will, to protect our sovereign America, if you will, the sovereignty, quote unquote, of this great nation, making us, quote unquote, great again, whatever that's supposed to mean. I always thought that America was always great, continued to be great. Now, we can't get the president to really talk about what it is that constitutes losing our greatness. You know, he didn't talk about that in 2016. He's not talking about it in 2018. And if he still has his health and et cetera, he won't talk much about it in 2020 when he attempts to run for another term, unless he has been confronted with overwhelming evidence from the special prosecutor. By the way, one of the quietest but yet most effective and most powerful individuals in this country today is Robert Mueller, the special prosecutor, special general counsel, if you will, investigating, you know, the Russian situation and et cetera. By the way, Vladimir Putin earlier today, while John Bolton, the idiot, was in Moscow to indicate another move by the president, which really needs to be examined as it pertains to nuclear treaties and et cetera. Bolton there to allegedly tell Vladimir Putin and the Russian hierarchy, if you will, that the United States will be pulling out of some nuclear agreements and et cetera. The fact of the matter is, Putin really doesn't care. The advantage that gives him in his continued bullying and intimidation of Europe and the European Union and et cetera is a well-conceived, well-designed plan. And again, it has to raise the question amongst real thinkers about what kind of gamesmanship is being played out by Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Just a number of interesting things. In the meanwhile, while we are not taking note, as we should, if you will, I'm well reminded of that period of time leading up to the war, the conflict, the attacks by Japan, if you will, Imperial Japan against the United States on 7 December 1941. The Chinese are indicating that they are not intimidated, nor will they be bullied. It's really started behind the tariffs, if you will. Some are saying, though, they're trying to keep a lid on it as they move into the final 2 weeks of the midterms, that it is China's tariffs against the United States is having more of an effect on the American economic base than you are being told by those that you are dependent upon, the fourth estate, if you will, the media and et cetera, in telling you, making you aware of who is being hurt by this. Here in the state of Minnesota, in the Midwest, quote unquote, we should be more keen in reflection and understanding about what these tariff wars are doing to the economic base of the United States, but we are spending so much time on other matters, if you will, that's not happening. I was just saying to the executive producer and executive director of MTN that it's amazing that we have, as it pertains to the fourth estate, our commercial news reporting and et cetera, that we basically have 6 minutes of news and 4.5 minutes of commercials and et cetera. And there are some ugly commercials out there right now as it pertains to the state of Minnesota as an example. You know, we always like to pretend that we're Minnesota nice. I mean, hey, everybody knows that's not true. Yeah, I mean, come on, let's be upfront with each other. You know, there are some ugly politics that are being played. In fact, moving away now from the international and the domestic scene per se, and really moving into the local scene, the Attorney General's race is really getting ugly. I mean, it is extremely ugly, nasty, if you will. Both individuals, Congressman Ellison and State Representative Wardlow, are extremely ugly about making it very personal. And unfortunately, that is really what drives us as the American voter and the American base. I mean, I know people hate that we say this, but it's, you know, how disrespectful we can be to each other. I mean, really, people don't like for you to say that, but this program, as an example, is all about facts, reality, truth, if you will. And things are happening in this country, and as people are moving an agenda being as ugly and as vile towards each other as they possibly can, and that's dangerous, if you will. I, as a much younger man, saw that period of time emerge in the late 1950s, all through the 60s and through much of the 1970s. It was a dangerous time. It was a time of bombings, if you will, of murder, and etc. See far too many of those who call themselves the children of the millennium, if you will, or were not even yet born in the 1960s, really don't ask the tough questions about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and particularly in the 1960s, the assassinations of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and many regional leaders, if you will. Medgar Evers, as an example, comes to mind. Both black and white. Rosal, the wife of a labor leader from Detroit, gunned down on a highway in Alabama, if you will, by white nationalists who actually were under the control and management of the FBI, which was interesting. No one really talks much about that particular situation where a white female activist was gunned down, if you will. You know, the system just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said they need to move on. And so here in Minnesota right now, it's really back and forth. I was saying to the leadership staff here at MTN, I just think the Attorney General's race is too close to call. The other races for constitutional office, governor, you know, of course, governor, lieutenant governor run on the same ticket, secretary of state, if you will, auditor, those things are basically within 5 to 7 points, if you will. But I notice that they're staying away from giving you a calculated number as it pertains to Attorney General. And obviously there's a reason for that. It may be addressed after the fact. I don't think it's going to be addressed in the next 14 days, but it will be addressed, as we said, when folks sit around in that period immediately following the midterm elections, particularly here in Minnesota, began to analyze what were the key points, what were the turning points, if you will. When did one lose momentum? When did one pick up momentum, and et cetera, if you will. These are good tactics. And if you do not have smart, calculating minds to know how to view it, analyze it, and respond to it, if you will, these tactics, then nothing really changes. It's business as usual. And then that raises the question of how, let's say in the case of the Attorney General, how the winner will hit the ground running. I'm most interested because on one hand, the congressman from the 5th Congressional District said that he was taking over the contest to become Attorney General because he wanted to take on Donald Trump. In a debate a couple of nights ago, his opponent said something that we had said here a number of weeks ago, and you saw it coming, and that was, well, if you really wanted to deal with the president and the presidency and the national agenda of the Republican Party, you would have stayed where you could be most effective, and that would have been in the Congress of the United States. You're not going to be effective dealing with Donald Trump being Attorney General of a single state, one of 50, if you will. I have to say, damn good point, real good point that was made by the Republican challenger. Of course, there were comments made by the Republican challenger that were met with a degree of toughness by the Democratic challenger. Well, not so much challenger, candidate really, because neither one of them are the incumbent in office as Attorney General. The Attorney General cut herself right out of the process and, quote unquote, filed for another constitutional office. And when the smoke cleared, she was out of business, Lori Swanson, if you will. So we watch closely the analysis of how will these candidates, now, you know, theoretically, all of the candidates, how will they hit the ground running? What things will they do for Minnesotans that will make things better, if you will, particularly, let's say, in areas like education. You know, now they've been telling quite a story for quite some time, and that story is that economically, these are the best of times. We haven't had it so good, and we don't know when. I mean, it kind of reminds me of a Cadillac in every garage, you know, a steak on every table, and a resort, you know, in every paradise. I mean, you know, when you hear him say it. Now, we've been following here on this program closely for quite some time the statistical data, which is in fact not available, that talks in terms of how well things are going. I've seen a number of signs as an example as we come into the studio, big pretty kind of signs, you know, that basically say we're hiring kind of thing. Sounds good. But then in the communities of color, you talk to people and they tell you about the large number of individuals in their community, their base, if you will, be they Native Americans or African Americans, who are not only without employment and et cetera, you know, they're without housing and any other kind of amenities that is important to a person being able to survive, you know what I mean, from the elements. And the reason we say that is that we noticed there has been kind of a quietness here for the last 10 days on the camp that seemed to catch people by surprise. By the way, they just a week ago admitted they have a similar but much smaller camp in St. Paul of individuals that are homeless, if you will, that are having a problem with regards to being able to exist in any kind of situation which you would call normal. In other words, with a roof over your head, with warmth, if you will, food, and et cetera. So we've noticed the quietness. One of the major indigenous groups, if you will, indigenous nations, indicated the availability of a piece of property on Cedar that could be used to immediately begin to build a kind of a facility and fix up some other facilities that would allow human beings to be able to find health, heat, and comfort, and most importantly, safety, if you will. I noticed that we've basically, in the Fourth Estate, stayed away from talking about the 3 deaths of natural causes in the camp, if you will, which then means there's a lot of illness. It kind of makes you wonder how many people have had to ask for admittance to hospitals and et cetera. First of all, 3 deaths of young people, by the way, is 3 deaths too many. But the city council, the Minneapolis City Council, came up with, what was it, $1.5 million to do some things. The ecumenical community has been on top of their game for quite some time. They were talking about this way back in the spring when there were like only 50 or 60 people there. We mentioned and talked about that here on this program on MTN in the mid part of the summer. We kind of had a sense that people just kind of dismissed it as just some people lazy, trifling, if you will, not wanting to get out and find the best possible circumstances and environment for them and their loved ones. I knew that definitely not to be true, but it bought a lot of time for politicians and others. But in the meanwhile, the ecumenical community and some segments of the nonprofit community were desperately trying to make things available to help folks, if you will. Remember, we first reported on this program exclusively 2.5 months ago that there was a police officer by the name of Grant Schneider that actually not only went out and got these very nice tents, but also was making available needles to those that unfortunately indulge in that, if you will, the whole drug and opiate situation that I'm quite sure that all of us are familiar with. We should be, particularly given the number of lives that have been lost just in the past 1.5 years, a little bit better than 1.5 years, if you will, that we certainly know that, needles are a prescribed, quote unquote, instrument, if you will, that people feel like they need with them when they are addicted, And so we watched the situation with the camp. We are hopeful that people will find the necessary accommodations before the real serious weather comes, which in Minnesota, here we are now approaching the last days of October, the fall, if you will. We've seen winter storms and blizzards on Halloween. who can forget that way back when, was that 1991 or whatever? And so we watch these things, and we always ask this question, as a historian, as a journalist, columnist, et cetera, I mean, what's really the plan? I mean, where is the plan? We hear a lot of money, a lot of money is being spent, allegedly, on the poor, on the least of our citizens, on the least of the human beings that are being affected by conditions which are not conducive. So that raises also the question of what's going to happen when these 7,000 people attempt to come across the U.S. border, the Rio Grande, the quote-unquote entry stations at Tijuana, San Diego, and et cetera. I mean, what kind of operations will be set up to prepare for them? I hear people now trying to get away from that interesting and I think unconstitutional action by the president 2.5 months ago, the separation of families, putting children in camps, if you will. Obviously, we're not supposed to talk about that, but it kind of raised its head again last night when the president called himself a nationalist. You kind of reflected back to 1934, 35, 36, 37, going into the Second World War, Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, the Nuremberg laws. I don't know how many of you are up to speed. We're not talking about the Nuremberg trials of 1946. We're talking about the Nuremberg laws that were put in place and were effectively in place by 1937. After, and this is a little piece of history, by the way, after a large delegation of German, quote unquote, Nazi social agents were sent to the United States to work, to get this now, to work on and to watch how segregation, racial segregation, worked in the United States. And for anybody that wants to jump up and say that, man, that's just something that's fake and that's that's untrue and etc., go back and look at two things during that particular period. 1935, 36, 37 in America, height of the Depression and etc. Take a look at Tuskegee, the experiments that went on there. We talked about that just 2 weeks ago on this program when we talked about and from the book The River, if you will, one of the most significant pieces written about genocide, as well as the book entitled, the book dealing with medical apartheid by Dr. Harriet Washington, an excellent researcher and etc. And of course, the other one was the case of the Scottsboro Boys. That's for those of you that want to go back and test, quote unquote, the authenticity of what we just said about events in that period, the middle 1930s. Scottsboro Boys was a case of young African Americans who allegedly had raped a couple of young white women, and they went on trial actually for their life. Well, the regime of Adolf Hitler sent a whole delegation here to see how things worked, to see how the race problem, which they were already beginning to set up. They had already, early in 1932, the Nazis, had opened up their concentration camps and etc., but their analysts, researchers and etc. had told them that really the best operation, the best platform, if you will, for racial animus, segregation, and etc. was the United States of America. Yes, this good old United States of America. And so they came here to, under the guise of viewing the Scottsboro case, if you will, also taking a serious look at the genocide, the infection of thousands of black men with syphilis, how that was being done also, because actually that was one of the things that that Dr. Mengele, people like to talk, I mean, it's amazing in this country how many people are really in love with the Nazi doctrine of dealing with, quote unquote, the more inferior and the least of us kind of thing, and etc. And Dr. Mengele, later joined by a group of individuals who, as we reported a couple weeks ago, citing the book The River by Cooper, that Dr. Mengele and these individuals became part of a group, some of whom were repatriated by the United States, our United States, and went to work in 1944, 45, 46 on what later became identified as HIV, AIDS, and etc., and affected millions of people in this country, some who are now in the last stages of that terrible disease and etc. And by the way, the disease, the infection known as Ebola, which actually had emerged about a decade ago in the same area, as reported in the book The River at the World Health Conference in Montreal, Canada in 1976, 77. That part of the world, Black Africa, if you will, the Congo, if you will, Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, the Central African Republic, the Republic of the Congo, and etc., is that this disease infection known as Ebola, which came out of nowhere, if you will. For a long time, it was kind of reminds me of the narrative by the Saudis with regards to the death of a journalist in Istanbul at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. that he got killed in a fist fight. In the case of the infectious diseases and etc., they said the monkeys were the carriers of this disease, if you will, HIV, AIDS, and etc. And then later, almost 30 years later, came back with when this Ebola, which emerged actually probably 700 to 800 miles north, places like Liberia, Ghana, Cameroon, and etc. That again, it was carried by the monkeys, and because the black savages of black Middle Africa eat monkey meat, if you will, that the monkeys and the black savages are the carriers, quote unquote. First it was HIV and etc. By the way, as we reported again, working out of the report by the World Health Organization and the book The River and Dr. Cooper and etc. It was tragic that the program that had been put together by the Nazi doctors and researchers, who initially was in New Jersey, moved from New Jersey to just north of San Francisco, began to spread with regards to infections, disproportionate infections amongst the gay population of San Francisco and the so-called Bay Area, to the extent that the United States Medical Army Corps indicated the program had to be moved out of the United States. It was that infectious, it was that dangerous, and etc. United States cut a deal with their buddies as they were just in the process of putting together NATO, if you will. The Belgians, who have one of the most significant histories of meanness and murderous intent as it pertains to being colonial masters. They, the Portuguese, the Spanish, if you will, the Germans, before their possessions were taken from them in the Versailles Conference of 1919. Oh, it's all there. But it was with great consternation that folks had a difficult time pinpointing the epicenter, if you will, of these diseases. And when the Tuskegee experiment first was exposed, even though it was initially exposed 20 years earlier by a African American nurse. For those of you that went to a play a couple of years ago at the Bramble Theater in St. Paul, it was African American physicians and doctors that exposed the development, the research, and the implementation through direct infection by staff personnel at the Veterans Hospital in Tuskegee, Alabama, that it was the government that did this. It was one of the reasons that the Nazis were so fascinated when they came here allegedly just to monitor the Scottsboro case, but at the same time thought that they would look in on this revelation by Negro doctors, nurses, and etc. about something called the Tuskegee experiment. But it wasn't out until 1948 when a white doctor in Rochester, New York, finally wrote a position paper which clearly enunciated and compartmentalized. It was so important. This infection and this outrageous government-sanctioned program that the nation just said, oh my God. One of the reasons was a fairly aggressive president named Harry Truman, who had a close relationship during his younger days as a politician in Kansas City, Missouri. Yes, the same Harry Truman, who directed his medical personnel, Department of Health, others, the United States military, and etc., to get on top of this. Of course, Many had already died through the infection and et cetera, which, initially started as early as 1935, 36. It was now, 13 years later, in Rochester, New York, and et cetera. All of these things are extremely relevant in the minds of the African American population, just as it is relevant in the minds of the Native American community, who never received the respect that they should have when they, 100 years ago, was talking in terms of infectious diseases that were brought into their lands by the so-called pioneers. People think it's funny when you talk in terms of blankets and et cetera that were issued by the Department of Indian Affairs, if you will, and the United States military that had been intentionally contaminated with infectious diseases that caused everything from typhoid to probably what was a yet unknown infectious disease that was similar to syphilis and things such as that. I know it's hard for some folks to want to deal with that, but it is a reality, it is a factual reality, and it is one of the things that we as a society, if you will, in our institutions, clearly do not talk about, And so as we move into the last 17 minutes thereabouts of this afternoon's program, we want to lay out all of these specific narratives, which are factual, and which talk in terms of a nation's relationship of respect and protection for all of its citizens. And we started out on this, moving it into this specific corner, if you will, with regards to the statement by the President of the United States in Houston, Texas last night, where he said, yes, I'm a nationalist. Yes, I am. So what? And I will continue to be blah, blah, blah. Yes. And we talked about that early on in this program, that nationalism, particularly white nationalism, is not new. It's not anything new. And in fact, as we repeat this again, the founding fathers, there were no founding mothers. Women had no rights whatsoever, be they black or white or Native American in 1775, 1776. But the acceptance that it could be declared that a document of unparalleled importance and significance, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, was now being crafted by the founding fathers and et cetera. The only problem is that it was only for, at that particular point, half of the population, because the other half of the population of that which was to become the United States of America and its 13 colonies were red and black people, if you will. And so when the founding fathers, carried on that significant event, if you will, that historical, crafting of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they were only doing it for actually less than half of the population, because we really didn't know the population of this continent, now called America. We had no idea. We do know this. We do know that in excess of 60 million Native Americans were ultimately disposed of, if you will, lost their lives as a part of genocide. Everything from outright violent genocide to well-calculated medical genocide and other forms of genocide, if you will. And so this is the reason that there is an apprehension in some quarters. Unfortunately, the African American community, the Native American community, do not have the wherewithal. They do not have the platforms to be able to talk about a situation. In fact, we as people of color don't even have anything approaching just one of the networks, be it CBS, NBC, Fox News, if you will. We don't have the capacity because all of those promises that were made were never kept. And so as we came out of the Civil War, the conflict, if you will, of 1860 to 1865, those things that had been promised, some people joke, but it's not a joke, it was in parchments of paper, 40 acres and a mule. We, the sons and daughters of the African, if you will, are still waiting for the 40 acres and the mule, and God knows that those people that were here before any of us, by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, who are referred to, we refer to them as the indigenous people, have never and will never get their land back, if you will. You know, in some regards, those people that are in that caravan who are now about 50 miles inside, as we speak here in studio, who are about 50 miles inside of southern Mexico, are probably really amongst themselves late at night as they are resting up for the next day's march and etc., are probably talking in terms of my land, my land, my land. You know, you speak it three times, if you will. So we have that, and we kind of got into this particular narrative because of the election, if you will, here in the state of Minnesota. We repeat again the observation that the race for Attorney General has been extremely ugly. In fact, it raises the question of how effective the 4 years of quote-unquote stewardship, whoever it is that wins of the two, if you will, if in fact they could even begin to be an effective Attorney General. Some are saying that because there was not any significant evidence of anything indicating that Congressman Ellison had been abusive and etc., that's just not true. You had to go read the entire document, if you will, and you also have to read the documents that were filed for the court case filed by the ex-wife of Congressman Ellison in a hearing that will be heard in early December. You have to read all of the documentation. You just can't pick up your little iPad and scroll up maybe 3 or 4 lines and indicate that you have been liberated and that the facts of what is being debated has now been substantiated, if you will. Let me also say that we want to thank those that have reached out to us, particularly the last two of the last 4 programs, the program with the CV Foundation that is building that beautiful $45 million complex in North Minneapolis. And we received a lot of indications of appreciation on the piece on Hospitality House, a very outstanding operation in our beloved city, and particularly on the north side. We certainly appreciate that. We try as we can to provide those positive things, but our responsibility here is to take a look at the current news, the factual news, if you will, and what is being proposed as a corrective action to make it positive as opposed to negative. That's what I'm telling you, that's a difficult chore as it pertains to this country, this society, and the issues that we are confronted with. It is difficult. It is a challenge. Let us also go over a couple of quick items. We are still waiting for the decision by the mayor with regards to the future of the current chief of police, Madero Arredondo, if you will, a man who we think has been extremely effective. As we talked last week at the Hospitality House events at the Metropolitan Ballroom, We had the pleasure and the honor of sitting at the table with Chief Arredondo and some of his command staff, if you will, Commander Charles Adams, the second of the civilian response groups and law enforcement response groups and et cetera. And so all of that was very positive, but we continue to look forward to those things that show that there is a move afoot to do the right thing by all of our communities, and particularly by poor people, or on behalf of poor people. We really are looking forward to that, if you will. We think that that is so important. It is so important with regards to what is being proposed as it pertains to the future. We just hope, in the case of Arredondo, that the mayor is prepared to announce fairly soon. You would think that in that Arredondo's term, which was the final year of ousted Chief Janae Harto, that the chief would be at least told by the 1st of November that he will be retained, if you will, and that the mayor and the city council look forward to continuing to work with him. We know that the community looks forward to working with Chief Arredondo, but we just get a little nervous in regards to the political arenas, if you will, when we see kind of a delay in action. Maybe it'll be in tomorrow morning's paper, you know what I'm saying? And they will kind of dismiss us and say that, you know, you were out there being premature and blah, 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 if you will. By the way, we've got about 4 to 5 minutes left, if you will. My executive producer is on top of her game. But the sports scene, I'm just not sure what happened to all of the highlights that we were being promised. The University of Minnesota football team seems to be having all kinds of problems. There seems to be significant chaos within the Minnesota Timberwolves, though they won their second straight home game last night in defeating the Indiana Pacers. We wish them the best. The most successful Minnesota sports team, amateur or pro, seems to be at the very moment the Minnesota Wild, the hockey team, if you will. Now, I know some people would say, well, what's a black guy know about hockey? Oh, we know a lot about it, buddy. And in fact, we may do a little hockey in-depth analysis for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. My executive director is about to fall out of the chair. But yes, we were a season ticket holder for 14 years for the Minnesota North Stars. Love that team. Love those players. Cesar Mondiago, Dino Ciccarelli, J.P. Parisi, the father of Zach Parisi. I mean, hey, man, we loved it out there at the old Met. Those were some great days. I was so hurt by it, I just really never decided to take up the opportunity to acquire a Minnesota Wild season ticket. But again, the Minnesota Wild seem to be the best and most consistent and sturdy, if you will, of our franchise. I think that the Minnesota Gophers, they keep talking about a young team. They were young last year. If this is year 2 of the young team, you would think that they would have gained experience, understanding, and et cetera, to the extent that they would not be just a young team now, they would be an experienced team. But that doesn't seem to be happening, and I think they're going to have a problem defeating Indiana. There used to be a time when Minnesota would not even be concerned about a game against Indiana in football. Now, basketball was something else. But anyways, the sports scene is all important because that's what keeps us absorbed and, helps people through the trauma of watching a unstable world around them. And folks really like to have their sports team, be sturdy and firm. Well, not quite like what happened in L.A. the other night. That was a real brawl. Them boys was exchanging blows and et cetera. But you really don't want to see that, because at the same time you want to sell sports to your future, that's your children, and you want to make them think that it is a ladies and gentlemen's game, if you will. It's really not when you talk in terms of the hardline positions of the owners. Sports is, and college too, because the coaches make all the money, players don't get anything. But the sport is about making money. I mean, we would like to think that it's 1923, 1925, you know, and it's about the joy of the game. And even the dark days of the Second World War, it was the joy of the game, and etc. Sports is about making money. And on that particular note, I'm hoping that these days, with, you know, I mean, I understand what people say about Michael Jordan and Carolina, if you will, the Hornets. But the fact of the matter is, you would think that for as long as the sons and daughters of the African have been participating in, quote unquote, the challenge of sports and et cetera, that we would have at least a couple of African Americans. We do have one Latino. He owns the California Angels, if you will. But you would think that the sons and daughters of the African accumulated enough money, certainly enough experience, if you will, that we could be talking when the owners of the National Hockey League, National Football League, National Basketball League, the soccer leagues, and et cetera, get together, that it's just not, you know, old white guys thing, if you know what I mean. I mean, think about it. You know, we reintegrated. Nobody wants to talk about that either. That's the reason we have these books here, a couple of books that talk about the difficulty of integrating sports in America. Yes, that's the reason we put them up there. But you would think that at some point we would have enough material opportunity that was given to us that we took advantage of, that we would have a couple of black owners in the National Football League, National Basketball Association, Major League Sports. In fact, I think it is so sad that in a sport that there was so much being talked about in 1946 when Jackie Robinson and a couple of other African Americans allegedly broke the color line. Now, see, that's also not true, because as far back as 1897, Negroes were allowed to play in professional baseball, and then a guy by the name of Cap Anderson said that Negroes shouldn't be allowed to play on the field. We actually played all the way until 1934 in the then National Football League, and then George Halas, yes, same George Halas that you see being promoted, and George Preston Marshall of the Washington Redskins decided that Negroes, because there were none playing in baseball and there were none playing really in basketball in the so-called professional, that Negroes should not be allowed to play in professional football. And we were pushed out of the sport, and we got back in only after the Second World War and a guy by the name of Paul Brown. Anyways, as we wrap, let us never be referred to as that race, a group of people, the sons and daughters of the African, who are referred to and have become extinct because we didn't do our research, we didn't take care of business, we didn't follow the history of what it was here and what it was that caused us so much pain. That's a terrible way to go. Let us always continue to be strength. On behalf of Very Fine Production staff, I'm Ron Edwards. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.